Welcome back to Bits and Boards. Today, I am Anthony Krolikowski, and for this episode, we are going back to UAlbany. Well, we're not going there specifically, but UAlbany is coming to us, and joining me is Jason Karachi. He is one of the associate professors when it comes to the game design program, which is part of a much larger umbrella when it comes to cybersecurity and everything that entails, which is way above anything that I know when it comes to technology. But first, sir, just tell me about this major, the minor, the undergraduate, and just the broad scope of what it entails.
Sure thing. So first off, thanks for having me here today. It's nice to be in the studio. So we are a new program that has kind of come out of a minor that was run in the informatics department. So it's a brand new program that is an undergraduate program and a graduate program. And it's a 4-year program for people who are interested in game design kind of as an art form, as a career, as thinking about going into industry. A couple things that make us unique in this space is that being at UAlbany, we're a Research One institution, which is really exciting because we get to kind of combine research and we get to combine kind of like building skill sets, thinking about what industry can be, right? So we're both kind of thinking about where students could go in industry, but also where that industry is going, right? And how research can help push where that's going. So that's pretty exciting. And then we're also, we're centered in the informatics department, but we actually have lines and faculty that teach in music and also teach in art, and we're bringing on faculty for cybersecurity as well. So we get to look at games from this really kind of like diverse standpoint, whereas some schools, their game programs are in the computer science department or it's in an art department, or it's kind of like, I'm not going to say it's kind of like keyhole in the department, but we're kind of trying to look at it as broadly as possible to give our students as many kind of intros and kind of into the games industry as possible.
A couple episodes ago, I had a very small indie developer on here who's local to the area, and he was telling me about when he was a kid, what it was like programming, and game design was kind of just seen as like this thing that wasn't like going to take you anywhere. It was just a hobby and maybe looked down upon is how he saw it. But obviously it's grown, and now college degrees have come from it and everything along those lines, and big tournaments when it comes to esports space. Put in perspective for me from your eyes, maybe when you were growing up or when you were first getting to this sort of realm, what that was like for you and what got us here today.
Yeah, I mean, I think of myself as like the first generation that really grew up with video games, right? Like, from Atari forward. At the same time, I didn't think of it really as a career, like when I was going to undergrad, right? So I went to undergrad, I studied political economy and kind of music technology. I think if I had thought about studying games, that would have been really intriguing to me. But the idea that people make games was a little bit divorced from kind of my experience. I think, I had a sense of like old Sierra games being made by certain people. I had a little bit of maybe, Sid Meier with Firaxis, but I didn't really have the idea of what a game designer did, right, or the industry as a whole. And so I went to school for, there was a technical side to what I did, but when I got out, I went into basically music software production. And then we started kind of incorporating games into educational software for those things. And so this idea that, people make games, this is a thing. And so, there's been a little bit of a resistance within academia for many of those years, especially in the 80s, about really where games sat within academia. But as the industry kind of blew up and got bigger and bigger, it just seemed, and their cultural effects got bigger and bigger. Funny enough, I think cultural studies kind of took on game design before kind of we saw more game design programs. So like, kind of thinking about like what do games do in culture were being studied, but there weren't as many programs that were really studying what it means to make a game, how to make a game. And then there was a little bit, because it's games, there was a little bit of, I don't want to say ill will, but like a stereotype of what that meant, right? And you even see this today where a lot of computer science departments don't want anything to do with game design, which is really funny, right? So I used to teach in Baltimore, and I used to run joint classes between the art and design school I worked at, but also with Johns Hopkins, right? But their computer science department wanted nothing to do with game design. They had one class, one semester a year, and that was it. at the same time, in the Baltimore area, there were tons of studios that were actually founded by people who went through the Hopkins computer science program, right? So, and I think it's partly about what we take seriously within academia, right? And what parents are also willing to pay to put their kids through, right? Through academia, it's a very expensive. College can be very expensive. But I think, as my generation's gotten older and become parents, right? The idea of the seriousness of games and the seriousness of play and what effect that has in culture, I think it's kind of just undeniable now. So I think there's a lot more students that understand and maybe even know more people who are creators who have made games and people who are the designer of games or teams that have made games and the studios behind games. I had less of an awareness when I was growing up, but I think, if you were to say Naughty Dog now, right, to certain students, they would know that they made Last of Us, right? They might have, and their parents know that that's also on HBO as a TV show, right? So the kind of cultural effects and kind of like the wide range effect that games have on culture are just more widely known. So I think studying it has gotten less of a kind of stigma to it.
Adding on to the workflow and what it entails to make a game, talk to me about the kind of classes offered through these different programs, either the graduate, undergraduate, minor, everything, and just all the angles that it comes to. Because it's not just coding. There's a lot that goes into making something like this.
Yeah, that's there's a, cultural critic that, kind of said that like one of the things about games is that it kind of subsumes all other mediums, right? So it is animation, it is sound, it is systems design, it is programming, right? It does everything that television does and then goes beyond that, right? So there's so many different skill sets to kind of making a game that's one of the reasons why our program has art faculty and music faculty and cybersecurity faculty and, faculty like myself that are more on the programming side. So there's a lot of avenues to kind of get into games, right? You can do games just from a business perspective, right? The business of selling and marketing games is a whole other thing. The business of kind of making games secure. So if you're on Fortnite or if you're on a live service game, making sure that that's a secure service and a safe service for people, that's a whole other avenue. Doing the art of games is a whole other avenue, right? I have students that have graduated that got really good at doing like effects for games. And by that I mean like special effects, like when you see little particle trails and things like that. That's a whole job and a whole specialty within games, right? So, when we think about what we're teaching in the core classes for the minor, the graduate program, and the undergrad program, it's one, understanding the basic pipeline, what it means to make a game and to develop a game, and to give you those kind of core skill sets where you can do the research, you can do design, you can do enough programming, you can do enough art where you can prototype your ideas, right? But at the same time as I'm saying that, I make it sound like a very individual kind of experience when that's not what making games is all about. It's actually a team sport, right? So while we're building those individual skills so you can do that, you're always working on group projects with other people who are also learning those skills. But sometimes what happens over the course of the 4 years or the 2 years when you're studying with us is that students realize kind of what part of that pipeline they're really interested in, right, and what they want to focus on. So somebody says, I really love programming, right, or I really love the art, or I really love the storytelling, or I really love the production of it, right? So like I've had a lot of students that have gotten jobs just being producers for games, right? So they are not the ones designing the game. They're not programming. They're not doing the sound. They're not doing the art. They're making sure that that team actually kind of can work together to actually build the game in a complex kind of system.
And when it comes to when you were making games and also the classes that you teach, what has been your favorite aspect of game creation? I don't think it's going to be the more artsy side. Maybe it sounds like you're more on the programming end, but I could be totally wrong here. So what was your favorite?
I do both. My bread and butter oftentimes is kind of teaching people who are not programmers how to program, right? So people who come from maybe not a computer science background, or maybe from an art, maybe from a storytelling background, about how to actually work with code, how to actually work with a game engine, how to make their first prototypes. So for me, that's really exciting, right? Like when somebody comes in and is terrified of programming and terrified of the idea of coding, and it can be a real struggle, when they get to the point where they can make a square move, right, and a square hit another square, right, and then something happen, and then we can structure that into some kind of playful experience. I guess for me, it's like getting the basic skills so people can start making games. Whether that be digital or not digital. A lot of the early classes I teach are also, like our first intro class in our program is all tabletop, right? So you're learning to design games, you're learning to work in groups to make games, you're learning about the system design of games, you're learning about the history of games, but you're doing it in tabletop, right? Because we want you to be able to tear up paper, to use tokens, to be able to make something and iterate really quickly without hitting that wall of the tech, right? So that class is always really exciting because people, who are like, I've only played Monopoly or I've only played kind of more commercially available games, start playing more hobbyist games or kind of, games you find in the deep pits of Target back in the shelf.
Oh yeah, the D&D role playing spin-offs and offshoots that
the Wingspans, the things that have kind of like crept back into culture, main culture. But so when students, especially students who sometimes don't see themselves as gamers or people who play a lot of games, realize like, oh my God, this is really interesting. This is really, really compelling to make. And I never thought about doing this as kind of a practice or to do this as a career. That's exciting. And then at some point, what's also exciting is when students start making their first games and realizing that a good game doesn't have to be the most technically complex game. A good game is a thing that kind of creates an experience for somebody or a group of people in a meaningful way. And when we start kind of, even in the technical classes, when we can get a focus on those experiences that we're making and being able to critique those things and think about them and iterate on them and make them better over time, like that's the most fun I have in a class is when you see a project come in and there's like, oh my God, 80% of it's not fun, but man, there's like this 10% that is fun. All right, cool. Let's focus on that and let's iterate on that, and we'll play a new version of it next week, right? Because you're going to work on it, and then we play that and look. There's all these other possibilities in this space, and getting students to think systematically and to be okay with making something that's bad, right? Something that's like not fun at first, but then iterates towards fun, right? That's it's a good skill set for anybody to kind of learn, kind of iterative design in that way.
Earlier you mentioned that it's a team effort when it comes to some of these projects that your students are working on. And translating that to the gaming space, as I mentioned earlier, indie, which is maybe a small team or a one-person team, and if your bigger companies and groups, what do you see, and you also touched on this, but when it comes to students and when they go through your program and pass college or this one where we're currently at right now, which is still pretty early for you, but what do students kind of voice to that they're interested in or what they think is possible? Do they think, oh, I'm going to go off and work for this company with kind of my portfolio and hope for the best? Or are they dead set on, I want to have this vision in my head. I know I'm the only one who can do it. I'm going to take on this 5-year project. What do you see when it comes to realistic expectations and timeframes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things we teach and is hardest to teach in a game program is scope, right? How do you actually scope a project so it's the right size, right? And it's the right amount of effort to make that project. When students come in, they come in with, they want to make Fortnite 4, right? They want to make, giant games that they've been dreaming of their whole life, which is, you don't start by making, a giant sculpture if you're learning. Of course. You make lots of small things. So learning how to actually think about scoping a project based upon kind of like what the goals, kind of design goals and kind of creative goals you have versus the resources you have versus the people you have to work with, right? That's like one of the trickiest things to kind of teach. And what happens is in programs like ours, a lot of the feedback I get from students, especially when they go into industry, is and this makes them pivot sometimes, but they'll go into industry and they've been in a program like ours where they're working on, let's say at most a 5-person team. We don't really scale up that much larger than that most of the times, but usually it's around 2 to 5 people. And so they have a lot of creative control, right? When you go to a studio and you've got 100 people and you're the new person there and you're on the QA team or you're a junior producer or junior kind of designer, you have very little kind of creative control, right? And so this idea that your job now is to do this part and do this part really well is something that we try to teach them. We try to expose them to that they have specific roles on teams. But that sense of kind of that I'm going to hopefully work my way up where I get to have more creative input onto larger projects. But it also depends where they want to go because that starts becoming where people pivoting thinking, you know what, maybe I don't want to go to Activision or I don't want to go to Firaxis or I don't want to go to a big studio or a 2K studio. Maybe I want to go to a small indie studio that is only 6 people because once you're down to that size, everybody's wearing different hats again, right? So the person who's the level designer is also doing the sound, who's also maybe doing some producing, right? The programmer might be also be doing some modeling, right? So depending on the studio size, depends on kind of like what skill sets you're going to have to bring to the table. So the solo developer has to do all of it, but they have complete creative control. But they then have to do all of it. So I've had a lot of students that go into industry, be there for a bunch of years, and then decide that they want to start their own studio, or decide that they're going to work on at a full-time job outside of industry, so maybe in advertising, maybe for Facebook, maybe for Google, and then make games as an indie studio on the side. So there's lots of different paths that I see people take, and it's kind of that question of like some students just want to. I've had a student who actually worked in a studio up here, PUBG, who was just like, I just want to make pretty environments for people to play in, right?
Which is fair.
Which is totally fair, right? And he was just like, for my senior thesis, I'm going to make the prettiest environment that you can walk through with just the thinnest layer of a game to make you walk through that environment, right? And that's what he wanted to do, and that's kind of like the path that he went down. When I was in grad school, I had a friend who his senior thesis was basically like 3D fight animation. And the characters looked terrible, the story was awful, but they fought really well. And we were all like, Dave, what are you doing? I don't understand. Like you're not making this kind of like magnum opus. And he's like, I really just want to get a job doing combat fighting and kind of animating. He went on to work for LucasArts. He's had this career in industry, and he was like the lead cinematic animator for The Last of Us, right? And so he did it, right? He knew that path, that you had to have this one specific skill set that he wanted to but he wasn't trying to make the whole game. So some people want to make the whole game. Some people want to make one part of the game. It depends.
The whole game is a whole thing. Of course, it can be a smaller thing, but it's a bag of variety here, depending on what you want to take with it and your aspirations. But we're going to take a quick little break here, and then we'll be right back. And I have some questions specifically about your career, and then when it comes to the degrees itself. So stay with us. We are back. Now, Jason, specifically when it comes to you, I know we touched on it just a tad bit, but tell me about when you were out in the industry, either on the indie side or the big world, if you want to call it that, or whatever the specifics are. What kind of stuff you worked on?
Sure. So, yeah, my game design journey has been kind of, like most people, kind of a weird, crooked path. And so, like I said, when I got out of undergrad, I was doing music software, and eventually went back to grad school to kind of study kind of interaction design. And that's when everything I made started becoming a game, because when I was thinking about like what had the best history of interaction design and kind of what I grew up with, it was games. So when I was in grad school, I worked for a company called Game Lab out in New York City, worked with them for a little while, and then was always kind of making my own games for thesis projects, but also kind of independently as well. And then that kind of dovetailed. Even before I got to grad school, I'd worked at Hasbro for a little bit. So, had a little bit of experience kind of in kind of the toy and kind of game space as well. So my own projects have kind of like, they've been kind of mobile games. They've been, I also do a lot of tabletop games. So I have, some games with Games by Bicycle and Eagle Games. And I have my own game studio where we just put out a small trick-taking game called Bistro that came out this fall. And I also do games as kind of installation art, so games that live in kind of gallery spaces. I do games that live in kind of public spaces, a lot of live action games as well. I do arcade games. So I just came back from MagFest, if you know that convention that's down outside of DC. I have a game called Waddle Throttle that has an arcade cabinet that was there and has lived in different arcade spaces. And so, games for me are really, I look at it very broadly in a way. For me, games are part, art, they're part, entertainment, they're somewhere in between. I also make games as kind of research. So I've done projects that have used VR to help people with spinal cord injuries. I'm working on a game right now, which is using what we call an incentive spirometer. So it measures how well you breathe, especially after you've had something like COVID or pneumonia. And so we're trying to figure out how to kind of gamify that so people actually stick with it longer. So sometimes I'm making games for research. Sometimes I'm making games for art. Sometimes I'm making games for tables. Sometimes I'm making games for space. I think in my own practice, what is most important is games as being a social connector, right? So I think that if we think about when I was growing up, it was really novel to play a game on a screen by yourself, right? It was like, oh my God, we're playing a game. And now we walk around with screens in our pockets nonstop. We have screens everywhere. There's, I don't know, at least 6 screens in this room right now.
Oh yeah,
right.
We can count later.
Yeah, right. And so, the idea of what it means to play with other people is the thing that kind of connects my work. So whether that be in real space on a table or in kind of an art installation or through an arcade cabinet or multiplayer online, I think that's one of the trends we see in games right now is just that people want to play more and more together.
And sending it back to UAlbany here for a little bit, just explain to me the difference between the minor, the major, and the graduate program and what each one is kind of meant for when it comes to students and their goals.
Sure thing. So if you think about the minor as being a way to kind of get that core curriculum where you can kind of prototype and work on a team and understand the development cycle, right? That's for students that might be more kind of interested primarily in English, or they might be more coming from a computer science background, or they might come from education or a political side. That's to kind of give you kind of that core ability to be able to work in games, but hopefully bring in something else, some other discipline that's really interesting into this space. The undergraduate, the Bachelor of Science is a 4-year degree, right? So you're coming in for 4 years. You are making games. We're teaching you from the ground up. You don't have any experience. That's totally fine. We're going to teach you how to program. We're going to teach you enough art. We're going to teach you enough music. We're going to teach you how to work in a group. And then you're going to kind of specify which area you want to focus in at some point. So it could be narrative. It could be programming. It could be just design. It could be cybersecurity, right? It could be any one of these things. We can also come up with kind of custom majors as well. So you're going to then kind of focus in a specific kind of focus area, and then you come back your senior year to kind of work on a kind of a larger year-long group project, right? So that's kind of like your senior project, kind of bigger portfolio piece. But over the course of those 4 years, my thing is you've got to be making games as quickly as possible and kind of just make lots of things, right? So if you were to go to a school for photography, you would imagine you'd have hundreds of photographs that you would make during that time, right? It's not that you're going to make hundreds of games, but you will be making 4 to 5 games a semester of different scale and different sizes. But that's what's kind of expected, is that every semester you are working on your craft and you're getting better at it, because we need to teach you how to refine kind of your storytelling, your art, your programming, right, and your production as well. And then the grad is kind of take those skills and take them a little bit further. It does kind of touch on a little bit more of the business side of things as well, right? And so a little bit more on kind of how to get your games kind of out there in the world, or if you were to kind of start up your own studio, maybe some more of the business side or some of the managerial side of that as well. But we also have people who are coming from diverse backgrounds where they're like, I was a poli-sci student and I always wanted to make games. This is my chance to kind of also kind of pivot my experience a little bit as well. So we're kind of like helping people who've been making games for a while, but also bringing in some new voices into that space.
I know we touched on this just a tad as well, but I've done a few different stories on Mayor Pliers and her new administration that's come in, and she was talking about keeping UAlbany talent, or keeping talent that's here in Albany, or just the capital region in general, to they learn something at UAlbany, then they can share it with our local community. So just tell me about, when it comes to the capital region, or even just Albany itself, some of the different developers here, or studios, and that kind of community that we have when it comes to the game industry.
Yeah, there's a lot of great local studios here. And, my previous institution was in New York City. Great. New York City is amazing. It's great. It's a really hard place to get a full-time industry job because it's just a hard place to have a studio. It's just very, very expensive. And so, there's really interesting kind of history of kind of game design here. A lot of it coming out from the colleges that have been in the area. And they've done a really great job of kind of keeping a lot of the talent local as well. So there's, I love, before I was in Brooklyn, I was in Baltimore for many years at a school. And there's a beautiful history of kind of game design history there, which you see in these towns, which you might not think of as being big game towns, but like you might not think about Albany as there, but there's a really really strong sense of game design and sense of game design history that's up here as well. So that's great for us, right? Because there's people we can pull into events, people we can pull in to speak. There's potential internship opportunities. It's a great space for that. UAlbany is also nicely centered because we are a state institution. I can tell you we are a lot more less expensive, let's say, than other private institutions.
Yes.
So this is if I was a younger person right now and I'm looking at what's going on in the industry and I look at the news from the industry over the last couple of years of just layoffs, and I would be kind of scared a little bit about thinking about going and studying games. But being on the older side of this industry, I can tell you there's always this boom and bust cycle which happens where the industry gets really big. Usually there's some kind of consolidation of studios, right? People are laid off. And then what happens is oftentimes those people that either got laid off or were kind of frustrated by the studios they're working at, they leave and they start new studios, right? And they start hiring kind of younger talent to help them with those studios. And I think that's really exciting. That's really great. And I think there's opportunities to do a lot of more entrepreneurship because if you're going to school like UAlbany, you're not taking on the amount of debt you'll be taking at a lot of private institutions. So that for me is really exciting. Like having taught a lot of private institutions with a lot of amazing students who wanted to start their own studios, they were coming out looking at their loans and being like, I've got to get a job in an industry or I've got to get a job in an adjacent industry just to pay these back. Even though a lot of them had really great game ideas and were really good producers and probably could have made the next generation of games, I think UAlbany's in a nice position to hopefully do that.
When it comes to the next semester here, now you told me earlier that you had your first semester so far, coming up on the next one. Mm-hmm. So what you're looking forward to, the kind of classes that you got, and then for people who are interested in taking on the minor, the major, the graduate, whatever it may be, it looks like it's going to be the fall, but just kind of give me that in your own words.
Yeah. So, next semester is exciting for me because I'm teaching the intro class, which I really love. So that's teaching people who are completely brand new to game design. And then I'm kind of like at every stage next semester. I'm actually teaching 3 classes partly so that I can rework some of the curriculum as it's needed. I'm teaching the intermediate programming class, which means we'll start doing some 3D game design, which will be really exciting. And then I'm teaching the senior project class as well. So that kind of capstone class to kind of like push that final game out there in the world. So I get them next semester. I get them when they're kind of brand new. I get them kind of in the middle, and then I get them right at the end. And so that'll be a really exciting semester to kind of see where right now we have a lot of students that are either new to the program or we're in the minor as well, right? And so we're kind of, I like to think we're like in our soft launch year because we're kind of a new program. We're actually building out studio spaces. I think you guys have been to the esports arena.
Yes,
So
yes.
right, so
first TV station who showed up for the
that's
first
awesome.
one. Yes.
So we are also building out a studio space for our program and like a game hub space / library for our program, some audio spaces for our programs. And so this year we're building those out. We're hiring even more faculty, and so next year will really be kind of I think our first year where we actually have the homes that we'll be living in for a while.
Yeah.
So that'll be really exciting. So, yeah.
Anything else you want to add before we head off here?
So we are going to be doing a lot of more public programming in the future. And so for one thing, at the end of the month, we're hosting the Global Game Jam with our IGDA chapter. So that'll be at UAlbany. You can follow us on Instagram. So it's just UAlbany Game Center at Instagram. So we'll have some announcements about that coming up. We'll be hosting a conference in the summer, which is called the Narroscope Conference. So it's all about game narratives. It's a really great conference, especially for those of you who are interested in the story aspects of games. Great speakers, great workshops in that. And then in the fall, we're bringing back a game jam that's connected to Wolfjaw. So we'll be bringing back this thing called the Wolf Jam, which is another game jam that we're kind of putting into our normal schedule. So just look out for us. If you're interested in games, you don't have to be going to UAlbany to come to these events. You don't have to be, you just have to be around and interested in games, and we'd love to have you.
Yeah, well, thank you for joining us very much, sir, and taking some time out of your day. And we'll catch you on whenever the next episode of Bits and Boards is. So thanks for tuning in, and that'll happen then.